Hi class, so today we are coming from my friend's boat, which is a bookshop down at Stokes. So have a look. Very nice. We got the fire on, so nice and warm and cosy. So we're going to get to our next chapter in our book, which is Going to Bed, and it's still 6:49 p.m. Alfie lay in bed, looking up at Mrs. Stokes and Dolph. It's probably time to go to sleep now, Alfie, said Mrs. Stokes. Alfie checked his two watches. It isn't actually, it's still 6:49. Well, firstly, your watches might be wrong. Don't make that. They never are, face Alfie. They might be. And secondly, you've done all your routines. And thirdly, I'm still your babysitter, and the most important job of a babysitter is to make sure you don't get exhausted yourself and be too tired to get up in the morning. Is that right? Said Dolph. I say the most important job of a babysitter is to make sure the child they're looking after doesn't die. Mrs. Stokes gave him a look that Alfie could tell meant, I will not be lectured about babysitting by a dolphin, talking or not. Alfie wasn't sure whether Dolph would be able to pick up that kind of unspoken message, but he looked away and went click, 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 in what seemed like a told-off manner. But, said Alfie, I've just remembered one more routine. Really? Mrs. Stokes, opening her handbag and getting out all the pieces from the walls. Have you had those with you the whole time? Yes, she said, flicking through them one by one. Got to make sure you stick to them. She looked up. But there isn't another routine. Going to bed is the last one. No, it's not one I normally do. It's not one even my dad set up for me. It's one that Freddie Barnes told me he does every night, secretly when he goes to bed. Mrs. Stokes frowned. I thought we didn't like Freddie Barnes. Yes, said Dolph. I heard you calling. He calls you boring. Yes, well, we're all aware of that, said Mrs. Stokes. Well, said Alfie, it's more of a game, really, that he made up than a routine. But he told me he does do it every night, so I guess it does count as one. Right. Well, I've always wanted to try it, but I never did. Mrs. Stokes shrugged. Okay, what does Freddie Barnes' secret naughty routine involve, Alfie? Alfie smiled, turned his whole body round and dived underneath the bedclothes. Down he went, down and down, even further than he'd gone in the bath. The sheets ballooned around him as he slid into the depth of the bed. He was joined about halfway down by Mrs. Stokes and Dolph. Whee, said Mrs. Stokes. Whee, said Dolph. Alfie took this to mean that they'd forgotten their differences. So what happens, Alfie? Shouted Mrs. Stokes. You have to get to the bottom of the bed, turn your body round, and then get back out to the top before the enemy can get you. As he shouted this back at her, the three of them dropped out of the enormous tunnel of cotton on some concrete. They landed on their feet, except for Dolph, who landed on his tummy. Mrs. Stokes looked around. They appeared to be in a darkly lit street of a seaside town near the water. Where are we, Alfie? She said. Well, I think it's like the war. Yes, I thought it felt familiar. So, she rubbed her hands with excitement and looked from side to side. Who's the enemy? Germans? Viet Cong? Al-Qaeda? No. What's that smell? Said Dolph. Mrs. Stokes looked up and sniffed. Yes, what is that? That's the bit I haven't told you, said Alfie. That's what makes it fun. That's why it's called Escape from Farty Harbour. Mrs. Stokes and Dolph looked at him. Right, she said eventually. So if I understand you correctly, Alfie, what you're saying is that you let one go just now, before we dived under the bed. Yes, said yes. Yes, that's what Freddie told me you have to do. I kept it in specially until the right moment. Mrs. Stokes and Dolph looked at each other. Said Dolph, you know I was explaining just how about how I breathe air like you, only through my bowel? Yes. He nodded his head towards the town. A huge green glass cloud was billowing up over the rooftops, coming straight towards him. I wish I didn't, said Dolph. As he said this, many people came staggering down the street, choking and fainting and crying for help. Oh, my God, said Mrs. Stokes. Run for it. Escape from Farty Harbour, shouted Alfie enthusiastically. Yes, said Mrs. Stokes. Let's very much hope we can. It's been nice knowing you, said Dolph, and then he dived into the sea. Mrs. Stokes and Alfie ran along the seafront, splashed a little by the water coming off Dolph's escape dive, but it was windy as it often is by the sea, even by AC at the bottom of an 11-year-old boy's bed, and the terrifying green cloud was catching up with them. "Come on, Mrs. Stokes," shouted Alfie. "I'm going as fast as I can, but I'm an old woman." "Yes, but you're a magic old woman." "I'm not that magic," she said, in between great panting breaths. She was slowing down and started to hobble along. In fact, as Alfie stared at her, he realised she was looking more and more like she'd done when she first arrived at the house. He stopped running and took her hand. "It's no good, Alfie. No, come on, you'll be fine." But even as he said it, his nose twitched as he realised it was too late. They'd been enveloped by the terrible cloud. "Actually, I don't think it smells that bad," said Alfie. "Of course you don't," said Mrs. Stokes. "No one thinks their own ones do, but ugh." Mrs. Stokes, she coughed and spluttered and fell to the ground. "Mrs. Stokes," shouted Alfie, "hold your breath." "I can't, dear," she whispered weakly. "I hardly ever need breath the best of times." Her eyes began closing. The green cloud became thicker and smellier. Even Alfie now felt he didn't want to breathe it in. "The last time I eat candy floss, rocket and chips," he thought. "And as for fizzy chocolate—" Mrs. Stokes, is this the time where things get out of control and I nearly die but learn my lesson?" "Nah," said Mrs. Stokes. "Oh, good. I think it's the time things get out of control and I nearly die," she said. "No, Mrs. Stokes, no." "It's okay, Alfie," she said. "Well, it's not okay. It's absolutely disgusting. But I mean, it's okay to leave me. I'm an old woman." "But you're a magic old woman." "You said that before. And as I said at the time, it was only about 2 minutes ago. So I don't know why I'm having to repeat myself so soon. I'm not that magic. And now, I'm afraid, the overwhelming stinkiness of your fart has taken away all that's left of my magic. Save yourself, Alfie, save yourself." With that, her eyes closed. The green cloud thickened even more around them. Alfie felt the rising panic, the feeling that first appeared when Mrs. Stokes had been saying, "Just do what you like," over and over again, returning. He wished he hadn't gone off-piste with one of Freddie Barnes' stupid routines. Of course that was going to create trouble. He should have just stuck, like his dad had told him, to his own routines. That thought, though, gave him an idea. The post-school routines were designed to make sure he was in bed at appropriate time every night, and so that he got a good 11 hours sleep. That was why he'd never done Escape from Farty Harbour before, even though it sounded like fun. It was part of his bedtime routine to be asleep by 8:35 on weekdays and 9:35 on weekends. It was, in some ways, the most essential part of his routines. And if there was one thing Alfie was good at, it was following his routines. Even tonight with Mrs. Stokes, although they'd been very different from normal, he'd still done each one after the other, in the same pattern as usual, until the last one. So he said, "Hold on, Mrs. Stokes, hold on," and raised both his arms and stared at his watches and thought as hard as he's ever thought about being back in bed and fast asleep by 9:35 p.m. Because today was Saturday, obviously. Strictly had been on. He made the numbers 9, 3 and 5 with one dot after the 9, bigger than big, painting them inside his brain like a graffiti artist until there was nothing, not one thing in Alfie Moore's mind at all, except 9:35 p.m. and an image of him asleep as normal, with the watches on his wrists showing the right time. Part 3, guys. Now, this is the last chapter, and I expect you to read this in class today. Yay! So I shall be back in class in a sec. Bye.